Turn it on. Okay. Good evening and welcome to tonight's shiur Lilu Nishmat Avi Mari Dov Ber Meir Ben Ruben Halevi Marati Rachel Bat Harav Michael. And tonight we are going to be talking about parshat Massay. Wait, wrong button. Let's get the right button here. Which deals the primary feature of parshat Massay, at least is the beginning of the parsha. We have what is called the travelogue, a list of all of the destinations and travels of Bnei Yisrael through their 40 years in the desert from the time they leave Mitzrayim till they get to Eretz Yisrael. This takes up the first about third to half of the parsha. The rest of the parsha is all sorts of things dealing with the entry into Eretz Yisrael, which Be'ez Hashem will get a chance to speak to in some future time. But for tonight, I wanted to talk about the travels of Bnei Yisrael, and I wanted to look at the travels from the perspective of two sides. One, those travels that we've read about somewhere else in the Torah, and those travels that appear only in Parshat Massay. And if you had asked me before I went and started looking at this, I would have said, the bulk of this is stuff that is new, but a lot of the stuff that's in this travel log, as we called it, is repetition. And we have to try to understand what is the repetition all about? Why is this whole travel log here? Now the parsha begins by very simply saying, "Vayichtov Moshe et Mitzrayim l'askem al pi Hashem," that Hashem commands Moshe to write their travels and where they went and where they ended up, al pi Hashem, and these are them. Massayhem, these are their travels. The Mitzrayim, to each of the times they went out from the camp. So clearly, Hashem has a reason why all of these destinations and journeys are listed. And first and foremost, I think the first lesson of this whole parsha is often in life, it's not the destination, it's the journey. We have to understand that life is a journey, and it's a journey toward a destination, and yet we don't always reach the destination we thought we were going to reach or we hope to reach. So I think that is one of the underlying messages of the parsha, that we have to embrace the journey, not just say, oh my God, we'll never get there, because you probably will never get there. Pirkei Avot, Lo alecha hamlacha ligmor. We can't finish all the work that we have to do in this world. But we can't say, well, I just want to opt out. Can't opt out. You're here, you're born, you're part of the world, you got to keep going. So I think that's one of the fundamental lessons of this whole parsha, is that we have to embrace the journey and not complain about the journey, as we find Bnei Yisrael often did. But that's something that we need to think about. So, having said that, let's continue with, I want to bring Rashi's comment on what is the purpose of the travelogue, because I think it's important. And Rashi gives us two interesting reasons. The first, he says, Lama nichtavu amasaro ela. Why do I have this whole parsha dealing with all of these travels? He says, Lo diach chasadav shamakom, to show us the grace that HaKadosh Baruch Hu had for Bnei Yisrael. Okay? Even though Hashem decreed that they were going to have to spend the next 38 years, 40 years in the desert, we should not think that they spent every day of that entire 40 years that wasn't the Shabbos or Yontif traveling, that they got up and went from place to place to place to place to place. Why? And they had no rest. If we look at this entire travelogue, we will find 42 journeys listed. From the time they leave Egypt till the time they arrive at the border of Eretz Yisrael, there are 42 stations along which they stop, which the parsha lists. And we're going to go through them, Bezrat Hashem. Now Rashi says, by the way, it's not even 42. Tzei mehem yudalid. The first 14 of these 42 travels, shekulam hayab yishana rishona, they were all before the Chet of the Meraglim, Kodem Gezerah. From the time they left Ramses, they left Egypt, Paro throwing them out of Egypt, till they got to the point from where they sent the Meraglim, called Ritzma, which is not what it's called in Parshat Shlach, but that's what it's called in our Parsha. And so if we take out 14 out of 42, we're already down to 28. Okay, and we're going to get even lower. Okay, and why does he say that? Ritzma, because Shemisham Nishtal from Meraglim, that's where the Meraglim were sent from. Shenemar, I'm going the wrong way, my mouse is not working, it's going back. Shenemar, and the next stop after Ritma, after Chatzerot, is Ritma. In the Parsha of the Meraglim, the next stop after Chatzerot is called Midbar Paran, and that's where they send the Meraglim from. So that's equivalent to Ritma, which was the 14th of the 42 steps. So we have 14 stages of the 42 travels happened in the first year and a half before the Chet of the Meraglim. The Ode, and Rashi says it's even less, it's even fewer than that during the time they were in the desert. The Ode, Hotzei Misham Shmona Masot Shayu Achamitat Aharon V'Horor Ad Shtan Arboim. There were 8 additional travels that happened in the 40th year after the death of Aharon. Nimtza Shekol Shmonim Ushloshim Shana. So for the 38 years from the decree of the Meraglim in the second year till the death of Aaron in the 40th year, Lo Nasu Elo Esrim Masot. There were only 20 travels over 40 years. Not so bad. It's not the same as traveling every day or even every week or every month. It says that for over 20 years, over 40 years, 38 years, they traveled 20 times, roughly once every 2 years. Not that crazy a deal, especially after God decreed they should be wandering through the desert for the next 40 years. Okay, this he quotes from Yisodosh of Ramosha Darshan. This is what Ramosha Darshan explains as the rationale for this whole story. The whole chapter that deals with the travels is specifically to show us the graciousness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that even when the Jews were being punished, it wasn't so crazy. It wasn't so terrible, at least from a travel perspective. Okay, that's one opinion. Second opinion, he goes, Rabbi Tanchuma, Darash Bodrash Acheret, Rabbi Tanchuma, and Medrash Tanchuma gives a whole different reason. He gives a parable to a king. It's always a king and a son, who the son was deathly ill, and he went to faraway land to find this doctor who was known to heal this illness. When they were on the way back, his father, the king, told him all about the trials and tribulations that they traveled on the way there. So Amar Lo Kan Yashanu, here we rested, Kano Raknu, here we Karno, here we at this, each of the places the father then related to the son who had been ill and perhaps feverish the entire trip there, and all these problems, he told them all the things that happened. So too, Rav Tanchuma wants us to say that the purpose of this travelogue is primarily educational in nature, that we should learn from the past what happened in each of these places, whether that's a positive lesson to learn the great miracle that Hashem did for us at that place, or what Hashem did for us, or to learn from negative how we complained and how we have to learn better not to stop complaining and stop fetching. So each of these place stops has a significance. According to the Rav Tanchuma, the Medrash says that there's a significance that we have to understand. There's a lesson to be learned from each stop and each point along the journey. Okay. Having said that, we begin the actual parsha, which is Pasuk Gimel. Okay, now Pasuk Gimel takes us immediately back to where we would have expected the journey to start, in Egypt. Okay, by Yisumer Ramses, but here it's not just by Yisumer Ramses, by Achanu Sukkot. See, verse A fits the mold of this parsha. The parsha generally goes with the version. They traveled from place A and they are camped at place B. Then they travel from place B and they camp at place C. But here we have 2 extra psukim to explain the beginning of the journey. By Yisumer Ramses, okay, they traveled from Ramses, which was the city in Egypt, or the area or the region in Egypt where they all live. B'chodesh harishon, during the first month, Hanishas Yom LaChodesh Rishon. Now this is interesting because they traveled on the 15th day of the first month. What do we know is the 15th day of the first month? That is Yom Tov of Pesach. They traveled on the Yom Tov of Pesach. It says right here that they left Egypt on what we celebrate as the first day of Pesach. You shouldn't think that they waited till the next day. So there's something that the parsha adds here that they left immediately that next day. Even though we knew that from Parshat Bo, nonetheless, it adds it here and relates that as one of the lessons of the Exodus. The thing we are celebrating on the first day of Pesach isn't the fact that they were still in Egypt, it's the fact that they left Egypt on that day. Mimacharat HaPesach, on the day after Pesach. Now notice Pesach here in the Torah is not used for the Chag that we use it for. Pesach throughout the Torah always refers to the Korban Pesach. The Chag, the festival that we celebrate for 7 days, is always called in the Torah Chag HaMatzot. It's not called Chag HaPesach. It's called Chag HaMatzot. Pesach refers to the Korban. So here it is, Mimacharat HaPesach, on the day after the bringing of this Korban Pesach. Yatzu b'nei Yisrael biyad Ramah. They went out with a strong arm, le'enei kol Mitzrayim. This is a very important pasuk because and the Baal Haggadah makes this point also that we didn't sneak out of Egypt in the middle of the night. And Hashem says, no, we're going to leave in broad daylight. Anybody who wants to complain, let him complain. And obviously nobody complained because there was nobody left to complain. As Pasuk Dalet is going to explain, why didn't the Egyptians try to stop us? Because very simply, Mitzrayim Mekabrim. Mitzrayim were all busy in the cemetery that day. They were busy burying dead. They were busy burying their dead and bemoaning and in mourning because God had executed justice against all of their gods. Again, an important pasuk for us to remember as we begin the 40 years that it begins. We have to remember the past. We cannot forget the past while we're on the journey toward the future. An important aspect of Judaism, especially when we talk about the chain of tradition, how collective memory is a critical component to retaining our Jewish identity. The parsha is stressing that by taking us back to the Exodus itself, and not just saying, okay, they left because Hashem took us out. What happened a little bit, again, it's enough, just these two words, Mitzrayim Mekabrim, the Egyptians were burying their dead, is enough to conjure up, should be enough to conjure up the plague of the firstborn, the leaving, and the Mimacharat HaPesach, the day after we brought the Korban Pesach with smearing of the blood. Now, again, you have to understand that the majority of the people alive didn't experience either of those two events. The only ones who did were the 40 to 60-year-olds who experienced it as kids. So most of the Jewish people hadn't experienced that directly. They only knew about it as a tradition from their parents. Okay, so that's an important aspect that Moshe wants to relate here to this generation that's entering Eretz Yisrael, because they might not have remembered. Probably the vast majority of them did not experience it. Even the ones that did may have been at a very young age. Okay. Interestingly enough, you'll notice on the left-hand side, I've quoted a verse from Shemot, which talks about the actual Exodus. And the phraseology is, it seems to be almost verbatim. They traveled from Ramses. So here it says Sukkota, to Sukkot, instead of Ayachanu b'Sukkot, they camped at Sukkot. Okay, so again, all the psukim on the left side are going to be psukim from the story themselves, either in Shemot or in Bamidbar, where these place names are recorded. You'll see some examples, though, in the end, where Moshe, in his address to the people in Dvarim, will refer to some of these place names that were not necessarily referred to prior. So you'll see in the left side, there are two sets of place names. One, as I said, the ones that are past, already mentioned, either in Shemot as they happened, or in Bamidbar as they happened, or psukim from Dvarim that Moshe references backward to on the travels. Okay, they get to Sukkot, and from Sukkot they travel to Etam, which is in the edge of the desert. This is the beginning of Parshat B'Shalach, after Paro starts chasing after them. Again, almost verbatim a pasuk from B'Shalach, Vayisumi Sukkot, except there it says V'achnu Etam, Biktzei Hamidbar instead of Asher Biktzei Hamidbar. Okay, very simple psukim. And then from there, they go to Piachirot, which is Al Pnei Bal V'Chayachanu Lifnei Migdol. Again, very similar to the phraseology in B'Shalach. Hashem tells Moshe to tell the Jewish people that they have to take a slight detour backwards to camp before Piachirot, between Migdol and the Yom, before Baal Tzifon, and they should encamp around. And it says Vayasu Chen, they did that in Peshalach. And again, that pasuk here tells us the same exact thing. Again, these psukim are to remind us of the chase that Paro didn't. Okay, he let us go, but then he started chasing after us. Where they listened to what Hashem told them to do. Again, Moshe is ingraining in the consciousness of this generation that it wasn't, everything didn't go smoothly after they left Egypt. Paro decided to chase after them. It wasn't so easy. But again, you'll notice Moshe does not refer to any of the complaints. He just says, now here again, they traveled through the sea toward the desert. And again, very similar to where it says, again, the same phrase when the Jews are crossing the sea in Bishalach, it uses that same phrase, betoch hayam. And ultimately, after they leave Yam Suf, they get to a place called, after going for 3 days, they get to a place called Marah. Again, here it says the same thing. After they crossed through the Yam to the Marah, they traveled 3 days in the Midbar, and they camped at Marah. Again, Marah, as we know, takes its name from the fact that the water was bitter. Again, the lessons that are learned there, Moshe wants to reiterate them. The mitzvot that are learned there, he wants to reiterate. And again, the complaining, but Moshe doesn't mention the complaining, something that, if you read the story in Bishalach, that was where they complained about water. Excuse me. So again, we have parallels between our parsha and the Shemot, the whole travels, okay? They travel from Marah and come to Elim. Now this again seems totally out of place here in Massay. Should have just ended by Yisume Marah vayavo Elima. The rest of the pasuk, which is almost an identical paraphrase of the pasuk in Bishalach, Sham Shtemes Veinot Mayim Shivim Tmarim, is a very interesting pasuk because the number of wells or springs and palm trees in this oasis seems to be significant. And the Medrash tells us, why does it mention it? Because Moshe is alluding back to the generation long before, the one that first came to Egypt. Who were they? They were the 12 tribes. So there were 12 springs of water connected to the 12 tribes. Shivim Tmarim, 7 date palms. Why? Because when they got to Egypt, how many were there? There were 70 souls when they got to Egypt. So Elim had this allusion to the fact that this was, that Hashem gave them this spring perhaps, or this oasis, was to remind them that they got out of Egypt because of the merit of the patriarchs and the Shvatim, that it wasn't necessarily their own merit that got them out of Egypt. Again, a lesson that Moshe wants to reinforce, and that's why, according to Parshanut, that he again adds the fact that there are these shtemes veinot mayim instead of just ending the pasuk by Yisume Marah vayavo Elima, which it should have been based on this. Okay. Again, they travel from Elim, they get to Yam Suf, and then from Yam Suf they get to Midbar Sin. And here, interestingly enough, in Shemot it doesn't mention that they stopped at Yam Suf. They travel from Elim and they come to Midbar Sin. And when do they arrive? And here in Shemot, it tells us when they arrived there, this is when the man first begins to fall. So again, there's this connection here of Yam Suf, perhaps the miracle of the splitting of the sea, and the miracle of the man, that Moshe wants to link these two together. Why it doesn't go as it get from Elim directly to Midbar Sin. There seems to be this stop off at Yam Suf. Okay, we then continue. Now here, once we've gotten to Midbar Sin, we find the first two place names that have no mention whatsoever in Shemot. From Midbar Sin, they travel to Dafka. From Dafka, they travel to Alush. Now these are the first two place names in the travelogue that we've gotten to so far that did not have a corresponding travel in Shemot, not mentioned at all. Why they're here? Because Moshe here is now listing all of the stops. The question more is, why aren't they mentioned in Shemot? Probably because nobody complained there, no miracle happened there, nothing. It was an orderly travel from place to place. Wow, we actually got a couple right. We got a couple things right where nothing of significance happened other than the fact that they are traveling and as Hashem is telling them to travel. So perhaps that's a good sign rather than a negative sign, the fact that they weren't mentioned in Shemot. Okay, we get further in Shemot. We get back to the next step is Vayisume Alush Vayachanu B'Refidim. Below Hayashamayim Lo Mishtot. We all know about what happened in Refidim. Okay, again, very similar to the phrase we had in Shmos. Here, interesting enough, it says they traveled from Midbar Sin, which leads us to believe that Dafka and Alush were two stopping points within Midbar Sin that they also stopped off at. And then they get to Refidim, and there was no water. And we know what happened in Refidim. Hashem tells Moshe to strike the rock. He does. Water comes out. Everything is fine. And then we get into the war with Amalek at Refidim. But that's, again, the war not mentioned here because we're into travel here. Again, very similar to the pasuk we have in Sefer Shemot. And it even tells us the date, tells us that this was on the third month in Shemot. We're now in Parshat Yitro. We've crossed from Bishalach to Yitro. And now the next travel that we're going to take, suddenly at Midbar Sinai or at Har Sinai, we now stop for a year, almost a year. They arrive at Har Sinai on the first day of the third month, first day of Sivan, year of the Exodus, 2448. They do not leave until the 20th day of Iyar, almost an entire year later, till they leave Har Sinai. So we've left the book of Shemot. This is the last travel we're going to have in the book of Shemot because the book of Shemot ends with the Jews still camped around Har Sinai. Vayikra is all laws. There's no traveling. There's very little historical information in the book of Vayikra in general. And we're going to pick up, we're going to see the next travel after they leave Har Sinai. We've now gone all the way from Parshat Yitro to Parshat Baalotcha. So we've traveled through quite a distance in terms of the Torah, but in terms of chronology, we're talking about a little less than a year from the time they get to Har Sinai till they leave Har Sinai. And then we travel at Har Sinai in Baalotcha. We were told that Vayisu b'nei Yisrael Massay midbar Sinai, and the Anan reaches Midbar Paran. That's where they stop, and they travel for 3 days, and then they reach a place which is called Taveirah, which does not appear in the travelogue. They call the name of the place Taveirah, where they first reached, but then there's another complaint, and they call the same name of the place Kivrot HaTava. So from Har Midbar Sinai, the first thing our parsha mentions is that they arrived in Kivrot HaTava. Kivrot HaTava is where they complained they had no meat. Hashem sends the Slav birds, they eat the birds, and many people die of the plague. Okay, from Kivrot HaTava, they travel to Chatzerot. This is the end of Parshat Baalotcha. Again, virtually the same pasuk, except here it's in the passive tense. In Baalotcha, it's in the passive tense. From Kivrot HaTava, they traveled, and here it's positive. It's active. Vayisu, they traveled from, rather than from there they traveled. The people traveled, and they arrive at Chatzerot. Now at Chatzerot, we know is where the incident with Miriam happened. So we finished in the last pasuk in Parshat Baalotcha, which after it tells us about the story about Miriam, tells us after that, Nasua mechatzerot vayachanu b'midbar paran. They travel and they camp at Midbar Paran. Now you'll notice I've switched from blue, which were those where we have commonalities, to yellow where we have no commonalities. Okay, Ritma, as Rashi mentioned before, is the name of the place from whence the Meraglim are dispatched. We know that because it says, and from Chatzerot they went to Midbar Paran. And we know that Moshe sends the Meraglim, as we read in Parshat Shlach, from Midbar Paran. And they go up. Now it's interesting because even though it's referred to as Midbar Paran, the place they depart from is also called Midbar Tzin. When they spy out the land, it's said Midbar Tzin from Midbar Tzin, which was their departure point. They go all the way up to the north, to the other side of Eretz Yisrael, and then come all the way back. They arrive back, interestingly enough, to Midbar Paran, and the place they return to, Moshe and Aaron, after the spies come back, is called Kadesha, or Kadesh. To Kadesh they return. So remember that Kadesh, because that's going to be important as we go through our travel log. Because the next thing we're going to see is now we know that after the Chet of the Meraglim, Hashem tells Moshe V'Amaleki V'Aknani Yoshev Ba'emek, Penu Machar Penus Olachem Hamidbar Derech Yamsuf. Can't go into Eretz Yisrael now, even though you were standing on the threshold of going into Eretz Yisrael. Turn back around. You're going back toward Yamsuf. Okay, and now in our parsha we're going to have a whole list of travels. They go from Rimon Risma to Rimon Peretz to Livna to Risa to Kelata Harshafer to Chadrada, Charadma Kelot Tachat Tarat Mitka, Chashmona, Mosay Road, Pnei Akan, Charagudgad, Yadvata, Avrona, and Etzion Gaver. Okay, they finally, after Etzion Gaver, they get back to Midbar Tzin Hi Kadesh. Okay, we've gone through a whole series of wanderings. Get back to the same place we were at when we sent the spies away. Okay, now according to the Parshanut, these travels are basically that we just went through. Those are the primary travels that they went through during the years that they were waiting for the generation to die, basically. Okay, once they get back to Kadesh, we're now going to be in the 40th year. Okay, so basically from the second year till the 40th year, for 38 years, they are traveling through these places here. Rimon Paretz lived in 1, 2, 3 out of whatever, about 15 of them during that 38-year period. Now, the reason I highlight some of these in green is because Moshe makes reference to them in Sefer Dvarim in the Tochacha, and the Midrash gives a whole story about how after the death of Aharon, Bnei Yisrael started to go back to Egypt. They got frightened and they wanted to start going back and backtracking. And because in Dvarim it says that they traveled from Be'er Bnei Akan to Moseira, whereas here it tells us they went from Moseirot or Moseira to Bnei Akan. So it seems as though they were traveling backwards. And Rashi brings this medrash that tells us that Moshe is telling Bnei Yisrael that when Aharon died, they panicked, they started going backwards until Moshe had to forcefully send the Levium as his army to stop the people from marching backwards and go back to where they belong. So I just thought that was an interesting parshanut. That's in Parshat Akev. That's a flash forward where these places are mentioned that are highlighted in green. Okay. Again, the fact is Etzion Gever is Eilat Etzion Gever is the southern border of Eretz Yisrael, and that's where they arrive back to where they started at Midbar Tzin, Hi Kodesh. Notice here it's called Midbar Tzin. There is another opinion that says actually there were two different places called Kadesh, but I think there's pretty much the same Kadesh, Midbar Tzin, Midbar Paran. It's probably the border between the two deserts is this oasis called Kadesh. And now we've reached the end of the 40 years. And what happens in Kadesh? It says, Vatom Hashem Miriam et Sham. That's where Miriam dies in Midbar Tzin, Kadesh. And we know what else happens there. What happens when Miriam dies? No water. Moshe, we need water. Hashem says, Moshe, speak to the rock. Moshe does not speak to the rock. This is what is called Maim Rivat Kadesh and Midbar Tzin. So Kadesh, Midbar Tzin are associated with Maim Rivah, the waters of strife that caused Moshe and Aaron, at least from one perspective, at least the Torah seems to say, connect that to their failure in their leadership, and therefore they're not going to go into Eretz Yisrael. Okay. Notice, as I said, we've now traveled, we're in the 40th year. And we continue from Kadesh. The next time we travel, we've now gone through Parshat. We're now in Parshat Chukat, where Miriam dies. We've gone from Palotcha to Chukat. In Chukat, beginning of the Parshat, Miriam dies. Shortly thereafter, it tells us that they travel from Kadesh, and they come to Har Hahar. Again, the pasuk in our Parshat says the same thing. Vayisubi Kadesh, Vayachnu Har Hahar, Bikitzei Eretz Edom, and that is where Aharon dies. And interestingly enough, our parsha, now this is the only thing that we mentioned that we left Egypt, and we mentioned that the fact that we had no water in the Marah. We mentioned the fact that we had at Elim there was this oasis. We didn't mention the giving of the Torah. We didn't mention the building of the Mishkan. We didn't mention a lot of things. But now Aaron's death suddenly takes prominence in our parsha. Seems very strange. Seems totally out of place, especially since we know that Aaron's death was mentioned in Parshat Chukat. At Har Hahar, we had this whole parsha where Hashem tells Moshe Aaron's going to die. Moshe, Aaron, and Elazar go up to the mountain. Elazar is dressed in Aaron's, the big day of Begadim of the Kohen Gadol. Aaron dies. Moshe and Elazar come down alone without Aaron, and the people realize, okay, Aaron's died. Yet the fact is that it's mentioned in our parsha. Not only is it mentioned in our parsha, we have a few interesting additions to our parsha. First and foremost, it says that Aaron died. Where's my mouse here? Al pi Hashem, through the mouth of Hashem, literally, or the word of Hashem. Rashi quotes the Midrash that Al pi Hashem refers to the fact that Aaron died through the death called Nishika, which the Gemara describes as the least painful death possible. And the Gemara compares it, or the Midrash compares it to a person, the neshama basically takes off this cloak called the body and deposits it, and the neshama goes up to Shemayim. That's Nishika. And so I guess the best way to go, if you have to go anywhere, we're all going to have to go sometime. Neshama should be after 120 years at least, but that's what Al Pi Hashem is alluding to. It also adds, by the way, which is the only yard site recorded in the Torah. On the fifth day on the first month, which, by the way, happens to be this Friday, Rosh Chodesh Menachem Av, is Aaron's yard site. And Aaron tells us, by the way, that Aaron was 123 years old when he died at Har HaHar, which we really didn't need it to tell us because we could have figured it out by knowing, since we know that he was 83 when he and Moshe went to Paro. We could have easily added 40 years and known that he was 123. But the Torah tells us, again, this is to give respect to Aharon, that it's mentioned. And again, I think it's mentioned here, the Chodesh HaChamishim B'Echad LaChodesh is mentioned here specifically rather than when he dies, for the very simple reason that Av represents the month of potential. The Chodesh of Av, which is a month by the way, this parsha of Massay is always read on the annual cycle, is always read in the month of Av. It's always read on the first Shabbat of the month of Av. And it's the month we know is the month that we consider a month of tragedies. But in reality, it's not a month of tragedies. It's a month of missed opportunities, because every tragedy is a missed opportunity. The month of Av, if we go back to the original plan, before the Chet of the Meraglim, was supposed to be the month when the Jews were going to be entering Eretz Yisrael, conquering Eretz Yisrael. And unfortunately, when the Meraglim came back on the 9th of Av, or the 8th of Av, and the night of the 9th of Av, everybody cried. They changed the reality of that day. And we have to wait and try to achieve that potential. So I think the reason that in this week's parsha we mentioned the death of Aaron is specifically to remind us that everybody that was in that generation had the potential to get into Eretz Yisrael, and they were supposed to get into Eretz Yisrael. However, they didn't. So potential is a wonderful thing. Opportunities are a wonderful thing, but we have to earn our opportunities. We have to make them work. It's not that Hashem is going to just give us free ride. We have to earn them. I think Aaron, again, we know always represents Oiv Shalom, Rodev Shalom, Oiv Tapiot Mikarvan LaTorah. Aaron was the great peacemaker, the one who tried to achieve peace. And I think the fact that he dies on the first day of the month of Av is not coincidental. And that's why the Torah lists it, because it's to remind us that we have the opportunity in every year, in every generation, to undo the tragedies and restore the opportunities. And we do it by following in Aaron's footsteps in the way we treat others. That is such a critical component of who we are as a people and who we should be striving to be as individuals, that the Torah spends this extra ink in the middle of totally out of place to tell us about Aaron's death, to remind us that we can succeed, but we have to strive and work very hard at it. It's not something that Hashem can do for us. We have to do it for ourselves. Okay, let's move on with the travelogue. Another puzzle, as I said, seems totally out of place. We already had it again in Parshat Chukat, right after Aaron dies. The Canaanite king of Arad heard that Israel came and tried to wage war against them. And of course, Bnei Yisrael are successful. They daven to Hashem, and he is able to to overcome the Canaanites. But again, seems totally out of place here. Rashi wants to tell us, again, quoting the Gemara, says that this pasuk again is here to show us that when Aharon died, the Ananei Kavod, the world lost the awareness, and the Jews lost the awareness of the special protection that Hashem provided for them in the merit of Aaron. So again, this is, again, to give honor to Aaron, to show his greatness by the fact that when Aaron dies, suddenly the nations think, oh, it's okay, God's not protecting anymore, we can go fight against them. Again, we know that Bnei Yisrael through the years in the Midbar are protected by Hashem in the merit of the leadership and in the merit of the Avot. But nonetheless, to give kavod, specific kavod to Aaron HaKohen as one of those great leaders, we have another pasuk here in addition to the two that describe his death. Okay, travelogue, we can get back on track, and the travel now we're in the home stretch, if you will. Again, they traveled from Har. Again, here it's Derech Yamsuf. They went again on a southerly swing. Lisbo, but Eretz Edom, they had to go around the land of Edom. So they went to places called Salmunah, Punon. And then from Punon, they went to Ovot. And again, here in the end of Chukat, it tells us here they traveled to Ovot. This is after the story with the snakes and the copper serpent that Moshe makes are in between these two sections here that I've got in Chukat. They traveled to Ovot. From Ovot, they traveled to Yehavarim on the border of Moab. Again, very similar phraseology in our parsha to the end of Parshat Chukat. And then we have a divergence for the rest of the way. In Chukat, we're told they traveled to Nachal Zeret. From Nachal Zeret, they traveled to Ever Arnon. From Ever Arnon, they come to this well, and at this well, they sing a song of the well. From the well, they go to Midbar, to Matana, Nachliel, Bamot. And the fact that these places that are listed in yellow here on the left-hand side in Chukat are not mentioned is one of the reasons why the Mishnah in Pirkei Avot takes these psukim as not being place names, but as being a story about a journey of life from Midbar Matana, from a Midbar. If a person makes themselves like the Midbar, where they don't have to worry about what they own and how much they have to show off, Matana, Hashem gives them the gift of graciousness with another. And Matana Nachliel, and Midrash wants to take this as referring to Torah, that one who has made himself willing to learn from anybody and strive to learn and grow in their Torah learning and Torah observance, ultimately gets from God as an inheritance and reaches high levels of Bamot. Although, as I said, we can take these verses literally as referring to place names, the Midrash, because they're not mentioned in Massay, I think is why it takes this as being metaphorical and referring to a person's spiritual climb. They end up in Rosh HaPisgah, right opposite Yericho. And in our parshat, they mentioned the names of the places are Divon Gad, Almon Divataima, Harei Avarim Lifnei Nevo. They're right before Nevo, which is the region on the east bank, immediately opposite Yericho, ultimately where Moshe is going to be buried. And then finally, we come back to both places agreeing to where we are. As we see at the end of Chukat, right before we read about the story of Balak, it tells us that Bnei Yisrael camped at Arvot Moav opposite Yericho. So they're actually on the east bank of the Jordan, directly opposite Yericho, ready to cross over and enter. And with that, the travelogue of this week's parsha ends by and it tells us that they camp on the Yarden from Beit HaYishimot to Lavel HaShitim, so that you know that it's directly opposite Yericho, and that's the end of the travelogue. So as I said, I think the primary lessons of the travelogue are first and foremost the concept of the journey, that the journey is equally important. Yes, the destination is important, that we should be striving to continue to grow, but the journey is the story here in this, and we see that clearly from this whole layout of all of these places, that we're focusing on each place being a potential step for growth in our lifetime. So wherever we find ourselves in our lives, whether it's in Toronto or it's in or it's in Los Angeles or Highland Park or wherever we might find ourselves, or even in Modi'in, it's another step on the way that we're supposed to be utilizing to learn about Hashem, to learn about Hashem's world, to help others, and to continue to grow in our awareness of Hashem, in our Torah, in our mitzvot. And when we're able to do that, we can undo the tragedies of the month of Av and turn them into the opportunities of the month of Av. And thank you all for joining. Questions, comments, and feedback at this point. Anybody? Nobody? Okay. Then if not, I will wish everybody a continued good week. Have a great rest.